Hello, noswaith dda. I want to loosen the soil a little around a deeply rooted assumption that many of us have. That is, that every ancient culture must have some grand cosmogony, some epic tale about how the world was born from chaos or bits of divine corpses. We seem to assume that a first dawn is simply something every native culture needs. It all has to begin somewhere. But when we turn to the medieval Irish and Welsh texts, our primary sources for Celtic myth, we don't find that kind of story. And then our expectations lead us to assume there must be something missing. But instead of automatically trying to fill that gap with what we're expecting to find, a creation myth, perhaps we can use that gap, that open space, to better understand what we definitely do know about the Celtic traditions. Perhaps what creation meant for ancient Celtic peoples was actually quite different to the paradigms preserved elsewhere. I want to explore a possibility that the Celtic mythic imagination may have given speech, naming, sovereignty, and what we might call land memory as the foundational creative forces of the cosmos. And that if a Gaelic or Brittonic creation myth ever existed, it might have been so steeped in the logic of sovereignty and word power that it actually looked nothing like our assumptions about a creation myth. Ultimately, I'm going to suggest how a figure like the Morrígan in Irish myth might actually have carried a creational role, but without placing her at some imagined beginning of everything. I'm also going to draw on both Irish and Welsh texts, especially the arrival of Amhairghin in Ireland, and see how they fit with the patterns we see in broader Indo-European myth. So in the surviving corpus of Celtic literature, there is no clearly articulated Celtic origin myth in the sense of how the heavens and earth came to be. There's no battle between primordial forces, no giant dismembered, no cosmic egg cracking open. But what we do find is a relentless interest in naming places, etymologies, oaths, genealogies, sovereignty tests, and the ritual legitimation of ruler and land. The Irish dinnseanchas, or law of places, is a prime example. It offers narratives of how rivers and hills and fords and lakes all got their names and acquired meaning. Gregory Toner and various other scholars have argued that this corpus is in effect a kind of domestication of the land, what I might call more accurately a culturizing of the land, bringing the land into human culture. It's a process of naming and claiming and binding places to human and ancestral stories. But it isn't cosmic creation in the sense of how actual stuff comes into being. We should also remember that our textual witnesses are mostly medieval Christian compilations. The compilers almost certainly had their own agendas. They made their own omissions. They had their own blind spots. It might well be the case that these Christian scribes ditched the native Celtic creation myth in favour of the more acceptable Genesis of the Bible. But we could also argue that even if such a Celtic creation myth was written out of history by those bad Christian monks, we would still expect to find some echoes of such a centrally important story in a few other places in Celtic myth. In which case, the absence of evidence might actually point to a real absence. Maybe the Celts just didn't inherit a creation myth from their Indo-European ancestors. Maybe their attention was drawn elsewhere. If the Celtic tradition ever had a creation myth, we just can't find it anywhere in the surviving Irish and Welsh literary record. But what does survive might have served a similar function, as a different type of creation, not of matter, not of the stuff of the world, but of order, of memory, of legitimacy and place, fundamentally of meaning. The oldest and by far the richest manuscript collection that's been preserved in the Celtic traditions is to be found in Ireland. So if we were going to look for some type of metaphysical description of cosmic origins, it would be there. If the ancient Irish considered their world was spoken into existence rather than created from nothing, then there are a few places that appear to suggest this belief. We find perhaps one of the most dramatic examples in the conclusion of the Táin Bocúilne. It doesn't end with thunder or cosmic revelation, it ends with onomastics, with reasons for why places have certain names. The great epic essentially turns into a type of map. In the final struggle of the two great bulls, one bull leaves the loins of the other in a ford, and the name Athlúan, ford of the loins, is fixed. An army that claims one of the bulls blazes a route through the mountains, and the torn pass that they leave in their wake becomes Burnus Bocúilne. What remains when the violence subsides is a landscape saturated with memory and names and scars and history and ultimately meaning. Now, this isn't the bull becoming the world. It's the empty world becoming a real place through language and memory and myth. The epic's final scene is what we might call an inscription of place, a place being spoken into being. So we might say that the ancient Irish, and perhaps many other ancient Celtic cultures, weren't that concerned with a divine creation of the world, but with names and stories tied to fords and hills. They turned their country into memory and therefore into a real homeland. And neither is that to say that the bull dismemberment scene isn't resonating with those other Indo-European myths that describe the dismemberment of a great cosmic being as the creation of the stuff of the world. There may be some echo of that older myth in this scene. But because so much attention is paid to language and naming and memory, we can't ignore the influence of the Fili, the bards, and their claims to possess supernatural, mystical speech. In several places, I've seen the idea floated that the Morrígan could be, in effect, a creatrix figure, the original mother of creation. Some have speculated that behind her sovereignty and prophecy lies a hidden role in generating the very world. Now, that genuinely could be the case, especially if we see the Celtic goddesses in the lineage of earlier Neolithic mother goddesses. But there is, of course, another interpretation that focuses on sovereignty more than cosmic birth. Again, in the Táin Bocúilne, the Morrígan appears in various guises. She warns Cuchulainn she will come and fight him as an eel, as a wolf, and as a hornless heifer. She will do jealous battle with him in the shape of these many animals. But these transformations look more like embodiments of fate and legitimacy and boundaries than acts of primordial creation. Her role is to test, to foretell, to enforce a certain order at thresholds, especially where land, cattle and hero meet. In the broader cycle of Irish literature, the sovereignty goddess, or the lady of the land, is often the one who confers or withholds legitimacy. She is in that sense creative, but in a political, social, ritual sense. She creates kingship. She is fertile. She is, in many ways, the essence of authority. She doesn't, as far as we can tell, create the cosmos or the stars. But even if we accept that the Morrígan was never imagined as a cosmic creator in the medieval tradition, we can still imagine a lost version of her with creational power. The foundational power of motherhood is to bring forth new life, and that's still very much a part of who she is. It's just that there's no sign in medieval literature that that was her central function. And once again, we can't just blame those bad Christian monks and their patriarchal obsessions. There is plenty of mythology about the Morrígan and her sisters that could just as easily have been obscured by Christian dogma and ideology, but it wasn't. Instead, a lot of this mythology was actually preserved. So what if speech itself functioned as an act of original creation? When the Morrígan spoke prophecy, she was creating the future. It's echoed, of course, in Celtic bardic logic, poetry, incantation, naming, often carrying a fair amount of magical weight. Consider the arrival of Amhairghin in Ireland. As the Milesians land, this mythical poet utters an invocation, often called the Song of Amhairghin, in which he says, in translation of course, "I am a wind in the sea, I am a sea wave upon the land, I am the sound of the sea, I am a stag of 7 combats," and so on through many identifications with the natural world and the landscape. This moment looks like more than just a ceremonial utterance. The poet becomes the land he claims for his people. Out on the sea, they've been rootless and aimless, without a place in the world. But as these people step foot on the land, their claim to it is made real by their poet speaking that claim into existence. The Rhys brothers, respected Celtic scholars and authors of the classic Celtic heritage, suggested that Amhairghin's poem carries a cosmological power. In the act of naming, the poet creates a mythical unity of self and world. So maybe the reason no standard Celtic creation myth survives is because the act of naming was the creation myth. Maybe, in early tradition, the real magic wasn't slaughtering primordial monsters and cobbling together bits of the world from their corpses, but in speaking, the way the world simply becomes meaningful. The Celtic bards in Ireland and Wales and elsewhere might have been the high priests of a logocentrism long before philosophers started worrying about it. If so, then perhaps the Celtic tradition didn't need, or at least never really used, a tale of cosmic violence, because the more useful foundation myth for them was linguistic and fundamentally relational. In Welsh and Irish poetic tradition, a poet's speech was invested with time-transcending power. In that sense, poetry could potentially contain all of time, not just the beginning, but also the middle and the end. So maybe the missing creation myth just isn't missing at all. It's just tied up in the mysticism of bardic speech. Instead of asking, what was the Celtic creation myth? Perhaps we could ask, what did creation mean for the Celts? You can learn more about Celtic myth by following the links in the description. Diolch yn fawr iawn.